Sophie stood in the middle of the living room, her heart pounding as the weight of Ethan's betrayal crushed her chest. His eyes, once so familiar, now looked cold and distant, as if they held secrets she would never be able to untangle. The air felt heavy, thick with unspoken words. "How could you do this to me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his disheveled hair, but he couldn't answer her, he simply stood there. Sophie's gaze moved to the floor, where the memory of their once perfect relationship lay shattered. The lies, the deceit, the affair, it all seemed too much for her to process. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him feel the depth of her pain. But instead she stood still, waiting for something, anything that could make this nightmare end. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low and apologetic. "Sophie, please, just listen to me." But it was too late. The damage was done. No apology could fix this. The silence between them stretched, and for the first time, Sophie realized that she was no longer the person she had been. Ethan's betrayal had stolen that from her. Sophie sat on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the blank TV screen. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt cold and empty. Ethan's words echoed in her mind. "Please, just listen to me." But how could she? The betrayal was too fresh, the wounds too deep. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, but she didn't pick it up. She knew it was Lily, her best friend, checking in. Sophie hadn't been answering calls or texts, retreating into herself as a means of coping. She wasn't ready to talk, not yet. Why did he do it? The question repeated in her mind like a mantra. Every time she tried to push it away, it came back stronger, more insistent. What did it mean that she was still thinking about him? About what they once were? Could she ever trust him again? Thought terrified her. Sophie buried her face in her hands, tears threatening to spill again. But she was tired of crying. So instead, she picked up her phone and sent a single message to Lily. "I need to talk." Lily arrived within the hour, her face full of concern. She didn't say anything right away, just sat beside Sophie on the couch. The silence was almost comforting in a way, a brief respite from the chaos inside Sophie's head. Finally Lily spoke, breaking the stillness. "You don't have to talk about it yet," she said softly. "But I'm here." Sophie looked over at her, appreciating the quiet support. She hadn't been ready to speak, but Lily's presence was like a lifeline, steady and warm. "I don't even know where to start," Sophie whispered. "I thought he loved me. I thought everything was fine." She paused, staring at her hands. He promised me everything." Lily reached out, squeezing her hand, offering a silent comfort. Sophie continued, voice breaking. "How could he betray me like this?" The pain in her chest tightened again, but having Lily beside her made it bearable, just a little. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows on the floor as Sophie stood by the window. Her thoughts were still a tangled mess of confusion and pain. Ethan's betrayal felt like a wound that had opened again and again, with no hope of healing. She hadn't slept much the night before, but now the fatigue weighed even heavier on her, a constant reminder of the emotional toll. Lily had tried to get her out of the house, but Sophie couldn't bring herself to face the outside world just yet. "Maybe I'll feel better once I leave," Sophie murmured, staring at her phone on the coffee table. But the thought of seeing Ethan again, or even talking to him, made her stomach churn. She had always believed in love, believed that it could weather any storm. But now, with Ethan's actions looming over her, Sophie wasn't so sure. Her heart ached, but there was also a quiet whisper inside her, urging her to take back control. Maybe it's time to let go. Sophie knew she couldn't keep living in the shadow of what Ethan had done to her. She had spent days avoiding him, trying to numb the pain, but nothing helped. She was starting to realize that it wasn't just Ethan's betrayal that had hurt her. It was the fact that she had lost herself in the process. Her identity had been intertwined with him for so long, and now that it was over, Sophie felt like she didn't know who she was anymore. As the days passed, Lily had urged her to try moving on, but Sophie felt trapped between the need for closure and the fear of starting over. She stood in the middle of the living room, pacing back and forth, her mind racing. Where do I even begin? Sophie thought. She needed to make a choice, move on or stay stuck in the past. But that choice wasn't as easy as it seemed. Every part of her screamed to hold on to what was familiar, but another part of her, the part that had been bruised and broken, told her it was time to let go. She paused, staring at the door that had once been the exit to a life she thought she'd have forever. With a final deep breath, Sophie knew it was time to make the hardest decision of all. Sophie sat at her kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. The silence in the room was deafening, each passing minute a reminder of the emotional wreckage she was still grappling with. The night before, Lily had begged her to get out of the house, but Sophie hadn't been ready. She had tried to move on, to put the past behind her, but every time she closed her eyes, Ethan's face appeared, as if he had never left. The memories of their time together, of the life they had built, now felt like a cruel joke. Sophie sighed deeply, and looked out the window, watching as the sun started to rise over the city. It was a new day, but she wasn't sure she was ready for it. The thought of facing the world again, even with Lily's support, felt overwhelming. Was she ever going to feel whole again? The question gnawed at her. Lily arrived shortly after breakfast, as she had promised. She entered Sophie's apartment with a soft knock on the door, giving Sophie just enough time to pull herself together. "Hey, you ready to get out of here?" Lily asked, trying to sound upbeat. Sophie hesitated, staring at her reflection in the hallway mirror. She had been avoiding the outside world for days, but maybe it was time. The walls of her apartment had become a prison, holding her in a loop of sadness and confusion. Sophie glanced at the door, wondering what would happen if she actually stepped outside, faced the world, and maybe, just maybe, took a step forward. "Yeah, I guess it's time," Sophie replied quietly, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Lily offered a reassuring smile, stepping forward to pull Sophie into a hug. Sophie hugged her back, feeling the warmth of the embrace. And for a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine that everything could be okay again. Sophie and Lily walked through the city streets, the sound of the bustling crowd around them, a stark contrast to the silence that had consumed Sophie's life for the past week. As they passed shops and cafes, Sophie couldn't help but feel like she was in another world, one that she no longer recognized. "You're doing great," Lily said, her voice cheerful, though Sophie could hear the underlying concern. Sophie forced a smile, nodding in acknowledgement. It's just hard," she admitted. "I thought I'd be fine by now. That this would be easier." Lily gave her a sympathetic glance. "You're allowed to feel however you feel, Sophie. It's okay to take your time." Sophie looked at her friend, feeling a wave of gratitude for her constant support. Yet, the weight of the past few days still lingered. The betrayal still stung, and the fear of moving on haunted her. "Can I ever trust again?" she thought, her mind racing. But for now, she focused on putting one foot in front of the other. After a long walk, Sophie and Lily ended up in a quiet park, away from the noise of the city. The peacefulness of the area seemed to calm Sophie, and for a moment, she felt like she could breathe again. They sat on a bench under the shade of a tree, the leaves rustling gently in the breeze. "You're going to be okay," Lily said, her tone gentle but firm. Sophie looked at her, searching her face for answers she didn't have. "How do you know?" Sophie asked. "How do you know I can get past this?" Lily smiled softly. "Because you're strong, Sophie. You've always been strong, even when you didn't know it." Sophie nodded, feeling a small flicker of hope, even if it was barely there. She hadn't fully processed everything that had happened with Ethan, but maybe, just maybe, she could take one small step toward healing. The quiet park around her felt like a safe space, a moment of peace in the storm that had been her life. As the day came to a close, Sophie found herself reflecting on the small victories she had made. She wasn't completely healed, but she had taken the first step. The world didn't feel as overwhelming now, and she was starting to feel the weight lifting from her chest. Later that evening, she returned to her apartment, where the silence was less suffocating than before. She sat on the couch, staring at the empty space beside her where Ethan used to sit. The ache was still there, but it was quieter now, less consuming. Sophie took a deep breath and allowed herself to feel something other than pain, something like hope. Maybe this is the beginning, she thought. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, Sophie felt like she could face it. Sophie had been avoiding the topic for days, but as she stood at the coffee shop, looking at the menu, her thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. The confrontation she had been dreading was now inevitable. She hadn't wanted to meet him, but her own curiosity had driven her to agree. Ethan had messaged her, apologizing again and again, but Sophie's heart was conflicted. What was the point of this meeting? She had asked herself that question countless times since accepting his offer. Was it to find closure or to give him another chance? Sophie had always believed in forgiveness, but her heart couldn't help but wonder if there was still something left to salvage. As she sat down, the weight of her decision began to sink in. Would this conversation help her heal, or would it just bring more pain? Her mind raced, her hands fidgeting with her cup, her eyes occasionally glancing out the window, avoiding the thought of Ethan's presence in the room. When Ethan arrived, Sophie could see the regret written all over his face. He looked just as unsure as she felt. "Sophie, I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice low. His eyes held genuine remorse, but it wasn't enough to erase the damage he'd done. Sophie met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "You can't just apologize and expect everything to be okay," she replied, her voice firm despite the trembling in her chest. Ethan nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I know," he said, his tone full of guilt. Sophie's hands clenched around her coffee cup, as if she were trying to hold on to something solid. "Then what are you expecting from me?" Sophie asked, her voice quieter now, a small crack of vulnerability showing. Ethan hesitated, struggling to find the right words. The silence between them felt like a chasm, one that had only grown wider since their last conversation. Sophie wasn't sure if any words could ever bridge that gap. Sophie's heart raced as she listened to Ethan's words. He spoke of how deeply he regretted what he had done, how he had made a huge mistake, and how he wanted to make it right. But every time he mentioned how much he missed her, Sophie felt her heart tighten. How could he miss me when he was with someone else? Her thoughts screamed, but she didn't say it out loud. Instead, she let him speak, her gaze never leaving his face. I don't know if I can forgive you, Ethan," Sophie said softly, almost to herself. "You hurt me more than I can put into words. I'm not sure what I want anymore." Ethan reached across the table, his hand trembling, but Sophie pulled back slightly, her eyes flicking to his hand before back to his face. Ethan's face fell as he retracted his hand. He seemed to understand, but the hurt in Sophie's eyes was too much for him to handle. She looked down, trying to keep her composure. What was she supposed to do now? Ethan's attempt to reach out had failed, and for a brief moment, Sophie felt a surge of relief. At least he was listening. At least he understood that things couldn't go back to how they were. Sophie shifted in her seat, trying to process everything. "I just need some time, Ethan," Sophie said, her voice calm but firm. Ethan nodded, his lips pressed tightly together. "I can give you that," he said, his voice hoarse. But Sophie wasn't sure that was enough. Time didn't erase betrayal, she thought. She didn't know if anything would ever truly heal the wound Ethan had caused. The silence between them was filled with unresolved emotions. Sophie didn't know how to move forward, but she knew she couldn't keep living in the past. She had to start living for herself again, but that was a journey she was only beginning. She stood up slowly, grabbing her bag. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice quieter now. "But I think it's time for you to leave." As Sophie left the coffee shop, she felt a strange sense of emptiness. It wasn't relief. It wasn't anger. It was just a hollow feeling. The conversation with Ethan hadn't given her the closure she'd hoped for. It hadn't healed the wounds. It had only made them raw again. Sophie walked down the street, her thoughts swirling in every direction. Did he mean what he said? She wasn't sure anymore. As she walked, Sophie couldn't help but wonder if she was making the right choice by keeping her distance. But she knew she couldn't let herself be consumed by the past. She had to find a way to heal, even if it meant moving on without Ethan. Maybe this was her chance to truly start over, she thought, her gaze lifting to the sky, the first signs of dusk beginning to settle. Sophie didn't have the answers, but she was starting to realize that maybe it was okay not to have them. Sophie's first date with Daniel had been simple, but it felt like a fresh start. They talked about everything: work, friends, their favorite books, anything but the past. For once, Sophie felt light, unburdened by the weight of her history. As they sat in the cozy little cafe, Sophie caught herself laughing freely, something she hadn't done in a long time. Could it really be this easy? She wondered. The thought of opening up to someone again, of allowing herself to feel something other than pain, scared her. But Daniel wasn't pushing, and for the first time in weeks, Sophie felt safe. He wasn't trying to fix her, just letting her be herself. The conversation flowed easily, and Sophie found herself actually looking forward to their next meeting. It felt like the possibility of something new, something healthy. Maybe this was the change she needed. After their second date, Sophie felt different. She didn't feel the same heavy burden she had carried for so long. Daniel had been gentle with her, patient, never pushing for more than she was willing to give. For the first time, Sophie wasn't terrified of the future. As she walked through the park with him, she found herself talking about her fears, her hopes, even the small things that had kept her up at night. She never thought she'd be able to share so much with someone again. Yet with Daniel, it felt natural. His kindness, his understanding, began to break down the walls she had built around herself. She realized she was beginning to trust him. She could feel the difference in how she carried herself, lighter, freer, like she had taken off the armor she had been wearing for months. Sophie had never expected to feel this way again. So open, so vulnerable. But when she looked at Daniel, she didn't see the shadows of the past anymore. She saw someone who truly cared. That night, they had dinner at her apartment. As they sat together, Sophie found herself telling him about her past, the betrayal, the pain, the healing. It wasn't easy, but Daniel didn't interrupt, didn't judge. He listened, really listened, as she laid it all out. When she finished, he simply said, "You don't have to carry that alone anymore." It was the first time someone had acknowledged her pain in such a genuine way. For the first time in months, Sophie felt like she was truly seen. The weight of her past still lingered, but it felt a little easier to breathe with Daniel there. The weeks passed and Sophie found herself falling into a new rhythm with Daniel. Their time together was easy, filled with laughter and shared moments. Yet even as she allowed herself to grow closer to him, doubt still lingered. Sophie couldn't help but wonder if she was moving too fast, if she was risking her heart again without truly knowing if she could handle it. But every time Daniel smiled at her, held her hand, or laughed with her, those fears seemed to fade, if only for a moment. She knew the past wasn't truly behind her. She could still feel the sting of what Ethan had done. But with Daniel, Sophie realized she wasn't trying to outrun it anymore. She was learning how to face it, how to live with it, and still move forward. Sophie's heart was still guarded, but with each passing day, she found herself trusting Daniel more and more. The fear of getting hurt was always there, lurking just below the surface. But she had realized something important. She didn't need to have everything figured out right now. It was okay to take things slowly, to let herself be vulnerable in the safe space that Daniel had created for her. As they sat together in her living room that night, Sophie looked at him and smiled. "I think I'm ready to see where this goes," she said, her voice steady but filled with hope. Daniel smiled back, his eyes lighting up. "Me too," he replied, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. Sophie knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time she felt ready to walk it with someone beside her. Sophie sat by the window, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows on her face. She hadn't seen Ethan in weeks, but his presence still haunted her. After their last conversation, she thought she was done. Done with him, done with the pain. But now, as the days passed, she realized it wasn't that simple. The scars of the past weren't something you could just wish away. She had tried to move on, tried to put her feelings for Ethan to rest, but they lingered. Every time she laughed with Daniel, every moment of ease she had, a small part of her wondered if she could ever fully let go. What if I'm not enough? She thought. But she knew one thing for certain: the past had to stay where it belonged, and her future, whatever it held, had to be her own. Daniel had noticed the change in Sophie's mood. He wasn't the type to push, but he couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. One evening, while they were out for a walk, he finally asked, "What's on your mind?" Sophie hesitated, unsure if she was ready to share. After a pause, she finally spoke. "I'm scared, Daniel. Scared of letting go of the past. Of trusting someone again." Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her, his eyes kind but steady. "You don't have to rush, but you deserve to be happy, Sophie. Don't let fear keep you from that." Sophie felt a knot loosen in her chest. For the first time, she didn't feel the pressure to have all the answers. She just needed to take it one step at a time, and with Daniel by her side, maybe she could find her way forward. As the weeks passed, Sophie found herself growing more comfortable with Daniel. He was patient with her, never pushing for more than she was willing to give. One evening, they were sitting on the couch, talking about their childhoods. Sophie found herself laughing more freely, and for a moment, she didn't feel like the broken person she had been. Daniel looked at her with that familiar warmth. "You know, I like seeing you like this," he said. "Happy, unafraid." Sophie's smile faded a little, but she didn't turn away. "I want to be that person again," she said quietly. "I just don't know how." Daniel gently took her hand, his voice soft. "You don't have to do it all at once. You just need to start, and I'll be here." One evening, Sophie went for a walk alone, needing some time to think. The night air was cool, and as she walked, she let herself remember the good moments with Ethan, not the betrayal. She had loved him once, and that wasn't something she could simply erase. But now, standing in the quiet of the city, Sophie realized that she could still honor that love without holding on to the past. She didn't need to forget, she just needed to forgive. Both him and herself. She wasn't sure what the future with Daniel would look like, but she knew she was ready to give it a chance. Letting go of her fear felt like an act of strength. The fear that had paralyzed her for so long was slowly fading, and Sophie was beginning to realize she had the power to choose her own happiness. Sophie and Daniel sat on the balcony of her apartment, watching the city lights flicker below. The conversation had been light, easy, but Sophie felt a deeper connection now. She had learned how to trust again, how to let herself be vulnerable with him. As the evening came to a close, Daniel turned to her. "I'm glad you gave us a chance," he said softly. Sophie smiled, her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. "I'm glad too," she replied. "I'm not perfect, I'm still figuring things out, but I think I'm finally ready for whatever comes next." Daniel squeezed her hand gently, his gaze filled with understanding. Sophie knew that her journey wasn't over, but with Daniel beside her, she was no longer afraid of the unknown. Sophie hadn't seen Ethan in months, but he showed up unannounced at her apartment door. "We need to talk," he said. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she couldn't avoid this forever. "Why now, Ethan?" she asked, her voice cold but controlled. Ethan looked remorseful, his eyes dark with guilt. "I've made so many mistakes," he said softly. Sophie crossed her arms, trying to guard herself. "You had your chance," she replied, her voice firm. The anger, the betrayal, still stung deeply. Ethan stepped forward, but she raised a hand, stopping him. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her heart pounding. Ethan seemed to hesitate, his face filled with regret. "I just need you to understand. I was wrong," he said. Sophie stared at him, fighting the urge to let him back in. But could she ever truly forgive him? Sophie listened to Ethan's apology, but the words felt hollow. He kept repeating how much he regretted his actions, but nothing could erase the hurt he had caused. "I can't just forget everything, Ethan," Sophie said, shaking her head. She took a deep breath, her chest tight. Ethan's eyes softened, but Sophie could see the desperation in his gaze. "I never meant to hurt you," he pleaded. Sophie met his gaze, her voice breaking. "You did. You broke me, Ethan. And I've spent all this time trying to heal, trying to move on." Silence filled the room, heavy and uncomfortable. Sophie closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. The pain was still there, and she knew she wasn't ready to forgive him yet. But the question lingered, could she ever? Could they ever move past the damage? Ethan reached out, but Sophie stepped back, instinctively pulling away. "I'm not that person anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan's expression faltered, and for a moment, he looked as though he might collapse under the weight of his own guilt. "Sophie, please," he urged, his voice breaking. "I can't fix what I've done, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I'm so sorry." Sophie shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Sorry doesn't change anything," she replied softly. "Sorry doesn't heal the wounds you caused." Ethan stood motionless, staring at her. Sophie's heart was torn, but she knew she couldn't keep reliving this pain. She had to let go. "Goodbye, Ethan," she said, her voice steady. As she turned away, she felt a mix of relief and sorrow. The door closed behind her, and with it, the last of her connection to him. Sophie stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself. The cool evening breeze from the open window did little to calm the storm inside her. She had let go of Ethan, but the ache still lingered. How do you heal from something like this? She wasn't sure, but she knew she had to keep moving forward. Daniel had been there for her through it all, never pushing, just supporting. The guilt she felt about letting Ethan go was overwhelming, but she also knew it was the only way she could truly heal. She needed to reclaim herself, to build a future that didn't revolve around her past with Ethan. Looking out the window at the darkening sky, Sophie made a silent promise to herself. "I will move on. I will find peace." Sophie met Daniel later that evening, her mind still swirling with everything that had transpired. As they sat together, he could sense the heaviness in the air. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked gently. Sophie nodded, finally allowing herself to open up. "I let him go," she said quietly. "But it's harder than I thought." Daniel took her hand, his touch warm and comforting. "I know it's hard, Sophie, but you're not alone in this. I'm here." Sophie looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. She hadn't realized just how much she needed him until now. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was beginning to heal. The past wasn't fully behind her, but with Daniel by her side, she knew she could face the future. Sophie stood by the window, looking out at the city skyline. It was a quiet morning, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. The past was still there, lingering in the back of her mind, but it no longer controlled her. She had moved forward, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Daniel had been by her side every step of the way, patiently waiting for her to heal. They had faced the storm together, and now, Sophie was ready to embrace the calm. She took a deep breath and smiled, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. "I'm ready," she thought. Ready to live again, to love again, without the weight of yesterday holding her back. Sophie and Daniel sat together at a small cafe, talking about their future. It felt like a normal conversation, but to Sophie, it was everything. After all she had been through, after all the pain, she had found something real with him. Daniel had become more than just someone who helped her heal. He had become her partner, her equal. "I'm excited for what's ahead," Daniel said, his voice filled with warmth. Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Me too," she replied, her voice soft but certain. "I'm finally excited about tomorrow, not just surviving today." It wasn't perfect, and there would still be challenges ahead, but Sophie no longer felt burdened by fear. She was ready to step into the future with hope. Sophie walked through the park, hand in hand with Daniel. It was the same path she had walked so many times before, but today it felt different. Today, she wasn't walking with the weight of the past pressing down on her. Today she was walking forward, free of the baggage she had carried for so long. "This is it, isn't it?" Sophie said, glancing at Daniel. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice curious. This is my future, she replied, her heart filled with certainty. Daniel smiled, squeezing her hand. Then let's enjoy every step of it, he said. And for the first time in a long time, Sophie truly believed that every step she took from now on would be towards something better. Sophie stood in front of her old apartment, keys in hand. This place had been her refuge for so long, but now it felt like a chapter she was ready to close. She had changed, and so had the space. Her life had changed. It's time to move on, she whispered to herself. The door was locked, but she could still feel the echoes of everything that had happened here. The good and the bad. She looked down at the keys in her hand and smiled softly. This wasn't the end. It was a new beginning. She was finally ready to let go of what no longer served her, and step forward into the life she had been working so hard to build. She took a deep breath and turned to leave, feeling the weight lift off her shoulders with each step. Sophie sat in the living room, the sunlight streaming through the windows, filling the room with warmth. Daniel was beside her, his hand gently resting on hers. They hadn't said much since she came home, but there was no need for words. The silence between them was comfortable, a reflection of how far they had come. Sophie felt a sense of contentment she hadn't felt in years. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer defined her. She had rebuilt herself piece by piece, and now she was ready to embrace the future with hope. I think we're ready for whatever comes next, Sophie said quietly, her voice steady. Daniel smiled, squeezing her hand. Together, he replied, his voice filled with certainty. Sophie nodded, her heart full of peace. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged to herself.